As usual, another great guest, but a quick diversion. You'll notice that our full name is the Marketplace for Health, Wealth, and Freedom. Well, let's talk about your health for a moment. If you'd like to escape from the stranglehold of insurance and be able to see alternative doctors or go across state lines for care, then you definitely need to take a look at patientempowerment.mpb.health and see if that's the fix you've been looking for. Now, let's get back to the show.
Well, welcome folks to February 3rd edition of Freedom Hub's weekly webinar. I'm Charlie Froman, and I'll change the name on my video there with my co-host, Jim Graypeck. And we've been doing these webinars for 3 straight years, previously with my co-host, Jeff Cantor, who is feeling better. He may be back with us sooner rather than later. And today we have a really cool topic because we have a real eminent law professor who's got a great book that we want you to check out, The Original Constitution. But I like his conclusion that he'll get to in terms of abolition. I'm a long-time government affairs lobbyist type person. I worked for Republicans on Capitol Hill in the early 90s. I was at the Cato Institute. And so many folks are trying to quibble at the edges, reform this, reform that, put in new barriers. But fewer folks really say abolish it. And I love a group that featured the article that Rob wrote that brought us together, because the article said, and I didn't know this, that Justice Marshall in the 1824 Ogden decision said there is no federal role, period, for healthcare. It basically can be subsumed, I guess, under the police power that states have for regulation of the states. And that certainly applies with the COVID hysteria, because it's not like state health departments haven't done a pretty aggressive job lording it over us, crushing our livelihoods, sabotaging our lives. So in that context, perhaps CDC is duplicative, and it shouldn't really bother folks to let it go. And before I introduce Rob, well, I'll introduce him, and then Jim, you could say your piece. So Professor Natelson is a longtime professor in various law schools on constitutional law and various topics emanating from that topic. Now he's at the Independence Institute, not to be confused with the Independent Institute, whose President David Thoreau presented a year ago or so, and others have as well. Ivan Elan, my former Cato colleague. At II, Independence Institute, he heads the Constitutional Studies Center. He has been cited at all court levels. He's prodigious if you look at his bibliography. He's known as an expert in the amendment procedure process. He's really widely praised for his originalist expertise in the Constitution. I read somewhere that he knows Latin inside out, which apparently the founders really used a lot in the communication. So perhaps to get original ideas in context, maybe you do have to master Latin. I tried for 2 years in high school. It helped my SATs. It helps your understanding of English. I'll give Latin that, but boy, was it hard reading Livy and all that. So before Rob, you take off, Jim, why don't you set the context?
The context, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to share, and this does relate, I think it relates to our the presentation today, that the February energies, I've just been hearing a lot about this from, I kind of keep a hand in astrology and what's happening. And beginning now, I think they said, take notice of what stimulates you, because the double retrograde of Venus and Mercury is ending. And that means all of the planets actually are going to be moving direct or moving forward in the next few months. And that relates to us too. It's time for us to move forward with our purposes, our missions. If they haven't become clear to you yet, I suspect they will now. 2022 is the year of birth. The 3 2s equals 6, and that's the birth year. And so we're here birthing a new world. And this talk today is part of that. And this is going to turn into new types of living communities and so forth. Related to that, I've been hearing, don't look back, just move ahead, focus on your dreams and make it happen. Be invested in your life now as it unfolds, and tune into the flow. Look at what's happening around us, and actually look at what's happening. We have the Canadian truckers. Everything seems to be, pulling together. A lot of revelations. People are standing up. The medical side of it. So it's really an amazing time. We are lifting off and entering that Aquarius air sign, which is really the rocket. So the best way, again, to bring this together, if you're not practicing Kundalini yoga like Charles, is to be still, go inside, listen to your heart, and give yourself permission to be free, to go with the flow and to move forward. And I think that's it. We don't have to be part of someone else's vision as we've been for what life on earth should look like. So, and I think, again, that's what the presenter today is going to be talking to us about, abolishing the CDC or what have you. So I will let Rob take it from here. Thank you.
Well, Jim, thank you. Your discussion of astronomical bodies reminded me of a colloquy that occurred at the convention that ratified the Constitution for Massachusetts. As you know, the Constitution was quite controversial. Not everybody was in favor of it. Many people believed it would lead to too much centralization of power. Imagine that. And one of the advocates of the Constitution said, really, under the Constitution, we're going to get to elect these people every 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. Well, just a few years before that, Uranus had been discovered. And the anti-federalist response to that was, yeah, you're assuming they're solar years, but they're probably interpreted to mean the years of the planet that has just been discovered, which is something like 86 years for each rotation. As Charlie pointed out, I'm primarily a constitutional scholar. My educational background and training is in law, history, and also the Greek and Roman classics. I do, in fact, use the Latin language quite a bit, including in spoken Latin, because it was the second language of the founders. You really have to know it to get a full grasp of what the Constitution is about. In addition to my teaching background, I've also been involved in private business and in politics. In 2000, for example, after a career as a grassroots activist, I ran for governor of the state of Montana and actually placed second among 5 in the open primaries in 2000. So I know a little bit about politics as well. I'm a regular essayist for the Epoch Times, conservative international newspaper. And of course, Charlie Froman contacted me when he saw this article I'd written in the Epoch Times calling for the abolition of the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health. Now, I reached that conclusion that they needed to be abolished on several different grounds. One is, as a student of federalism, I recognized that public health really is not within the federal sphere of responsibility, according to the Constitution. And I'll come back, I'll have more to say about that in a minute. Secondly, as a lawyer, I recognize that these 2 agencies were exercising authority outside the realm of their statutory power. And I think the classic example of this was the CDC's decision to rewrite every residential landlord-tenant lease in the country by imposing an eviction moratorium. Well, I'm sorry, these people of CDC, they don't know anything about landlord-tenant law, and it's not a matter entrusted to them anyway. And their attempt to rewrite every lease in the country exceeded their statutory authority, which was recognized by the Supreme Court when the Supreme Court finally overturned the moratorium. Thirdly, I'm generally familiar with how the administrative state works. I don't think it is best for the country. And we can discuss later on some elements of that. The fourth aspect is that While I'm not an expert in public health, I know based upon history and how these things work, that if the NIH and the CDC were to go away, other entities would step in and do whatever they're doing that we really need. Generally speaking, historically, the federal government doesn't get into something because there's an underserved need. I mean, they may say that, but historically they get into something where the need is really being served. It's being served by the private sector. It's being served by state or local government. And the feds view this as a cheap way that they can expand their jurisdiction and their power and have an assured market for what they're doing. We have thousands of universities in this country, many of them research universities. We have many, many research hospitals. We have 50 state public health agencies, and plus the District of Columbia public health agencies. I think we can be pretty confident that anything that the NIH and the CDC are doing that's really important can be picked up by these entities. I didn't even mention the pharmaceutical companies. And then finally, I know both from my reading and from personal experience that when government becomes involved in anything, that field becomes politicized. I'll relate a story about this, but a number of decades ago, a University of Colorado classics professor and I submitted an application to the State Humanities Council for a series of lectures on ancient Rome around the state of Colorado. The Humanities Council is funded essentially by the federal government, and the federal government priorities determine their priorities. Well, they had been funding a lot of stuff that the federal government at that time, the current administration, didn't care for. The current administration wanted to see a little bit more in the classics. And so our application was approved. I was very happy when our application was approved, but I was somewhat chagrined to learn that the reason it was approved was purely political. And so social science, the arts have become politicized, and that's unfortunate. But it's more than unfortunate when science becomes politicized. It becomes disastrous. And I'll just mention one name, Trofim Lysenko in Stalinist Russia as an example of that. We've seen extensive politicization we've seen the evidence of extensive politicization during the COVID controversy. I'm probably best known, and Charlie alluded to this, for my work on the original Constitution, what its meaning was, and on the founding era generally. That's where I've gotten my Supreme Court citations, for example. And so for the remainder of the time I'm speaking, I'd like to focus on that just a bit, because I think that'll give you the best value, so to speak. When the founders were considering a new government for the United States, they had two basic models in front of them. One model was the model of the Confederation. Now, the term Confederation of the founding era basically meant a treaty organization or an alliance. In a confederation, the member states or the member countries retained sovereignty, and they granted to some central entity certain powers to undertake certain activities. A great example of this today is NATO. We have a North Atlantic Council, and the North Atlantic Council acts for NATO, but basic sovereignty is retained in the member governments. The founders had a number of examples of confederations they could learn from. There were our own articles of confederation. There was a confederation at that time in Holland, in Switzerland, and there were numerous confederations in the ancient world, or at least some confederations in the ancient world that they could learn from. So that was one of the models. The other model was centralized government. Everything would be determined at the center, and whatever local units of government there were would be given their powers only by grace of the central government. And an example of that was the government of Britain or the government of France. The conventional wisdom at the time was that sovereignty could only be in one place. Sovereignty could either be located at the center with the king or the parliament, or it could be located in the individual states that were components of the system. One of the great advances in political science that our founders were responsible for was what the late Justice Anthony Kennedy called splitting the atom of sovereignty, splitting the atom of sovereignty. They made the decision to actually divide powers so that the sovereign powers delegated by the people would be exercised at two levels of government, one set of powers at the federal level and the other at the state level. And the way the Constitution carried this out was by listing those areas that the federal government was authorized to act in and leaving everything else to the states. And among those items left to the states was public health. And as Charlie pointed out, in Gibbons versus Ogden, John Marshall, writing for a unanimous court, listed, quote, health laws of every description as a matter over which the federal government would have no authority, at least outside the District of Columbia and federal territories, that all authority would be at the state or local or private level. Incidentally, Gibbons versus Ogden is commonly read in law school, but that part of Gibbons versus Ogden is commonly taken out of the excerpts that the students read. Now, one objection to this is that, a leading objection, is that human activities are all interdependent. Commerce, which is interstate commerce, which is delegated to the federal government to regulate, influences agriculture and manufacturing and even non-economic activities like marriage and divorce, which are left to the states. Wouldn't it be better, the progressives argue, if we simply had one central controlling agency for all of it? Like, for example, public health, the CDC or the NIH could coordinate all of it. And many progressives have assumed that the founders didn't know about this interdependence of all aspects of human life. Well, they did know about it, and they talked about it quite a bit. But they also recognized that in the real world, you've got to balance values. You've got to balance values. And there are some values that are a lot more important than central control. One is liberty. And liberty is protected by leaving less power in any one set of officials, especially central government officials. They recognized that there was value in experimentation, what Justice Brandeis called the laboratories of democracy, where the states can experiment with different ways of doing things. They recognized the risks of politicization, and that if you decentralize power, there is likely to be politicization, because there always is with government, but there would at least be many competing versions of the politicization, and truth is more likely to come out than if you have one party line for the whole country. There would be more tailoring to local conditions. Conditions in New York State are very different from conditions in North Dakota. And that means that different policies are appropriate in different states. And then finally, in decentralized systems, some studies suggest that people have more satisfaction because they feel that they have more control over their lives if policy is made at the state or the local level or at the private level than if it's made at the federal level. And ultimately, if people are deeply dissatisfied with their state government, they can always move, as hundreds of thousands of people are moving now, mostly from blue states to red states. Now, this idea of divided sovereignty, of federalism, is very difficult for most people to grasp. You know, my law students were by and large not unintelligent. Some of them were very bright. And it was really hard for them to get through their head the idea that if something needed to be done, it shouldn't necessarily be done by the federal government. And so the defense of federalism is not really, you can't really expect the voters necessarily to defend federalism. The defenders of federalism in our system are supposed to be the Supreme Court and also the state legislatures. But the Supreme Court has largely gotten out of the business of defending federalism or limiting federal power. If you're curious to know more about that, I've actually written a series for the Epoch Times explaining how the Supreme Court, in the years 1937 to 1944, successively disabled restrictions on the federal government. And today, the court very rarely says that the federal government has intervened in state affairs. They pretty much allow federal government to do whatever it wants, so long as it doesn't violate the Bill of Rights. The other check for federalism is the state legislatures. And the state legislatures have from time to time pushed back against the federal government to protect their own jurisdiction, to protect the liberty of their constituents. They haven't done it enough. And one way in which they haven't done it enough touches on the amendment process, over which Charlie mentions I've done a lot, into which Charlie mentions I've done a lot of research. The state legislatures were given the power to force Congress to call a meeting called a convention for proposing amendments, which would then recommend constitutional amendments back to the states that the states could ratify or reject. It would take 3/4 of the states to ratify. And this was seen at the founding era as a major tool that the states could use to rein in the federal government if the federal government ever became abusive or exceeded its authority. The bad news is that the states have not used that tool. The good news is there is an active movement now, which has picked up the support of 17 states, 2 within just the last 2 weeks, for such a convention that would recommend constitutional amendments back to the states to limit the size and scope of the federal government. I don't believe that Congress ever really will repeal the CDC or the NIH. They may make minor reforms around the edges, but they won't repeal it because the CDC is controlled by their own statute ultimately, and that's part of their own power. But the states, on the other hand, or more precisely, the state legislatures, do have the authority to pass a constitutional amendment ensuring that public health matters are for state and local control only. I'm going to stop there, and if there are questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you, Rob. And folks, around the Zoom controls, you'll see the reactions option. And if you click there, you'll see the raise hand icon. We like to use that to keep the Q&A orderly. And I'll get us started. Think of your questions, folks. A lot of questions. This is a great topic and good presentation, Rob. Thank you very much. Could you briefly summarize what we can find at the Epoch Times about the abdication of SCOTUS's responsibility to protect our liberties in the states?
Sure.
I mean, you know, it started with the threat to pack the courts, right, from FDR?
Well, yeah, let's get into that. I start off by pointing out that when my dad was born in 1911, and when he grew up in the slums of Brooklyn, New York in the 20s, the federal government was really recognizably the same government that had been created in 1789. There had been important changes. Slavery had been abolished. Women had the vote. Congress had been given the authority to protect minorities through the Civil War amendments and so forth. But basically, it was still a small government of limited enumerated powers that was invisible to most people unless they happened to go to the post office or sign up in the military. Then the Depression hits, and the federal government starts doing various ways to address. The federal government starts to address the Depression in various ways, and these ways are largely counterreactive. Or counterproductive, so that what was initially just a stock market crash and probably should have been over in a few months becomes this long, lingering depression. Herbert Hoover adopted a number of spending programs, a restrictive tariff, and other things that made matters worse. The Federal Reserve System tightened the money supply, again, making matters worse. Naturally, in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt is elected, and he embarks upon even more experimentation. The Supreme Court is then faced with dealing with cases that come out of FDR's and Congress's activism. And by and large, under the leadership of Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes, the court made a good faith effort to accommodate the New Deal without stretching the Constitution too much. They did this 1934, 1935, 1936. In 1937, however, you had the first retirement, and FDR appointed his first justice to the court, partly as a result of the new justices being appointed, and partly as a result of pressure, public pressure being applied to the court. The court successively began to disestablish the various restrictions that the Constitution put upon Congress's power. So first, they adopted in 1938 a precedent which said that Congress could basically spend money, any money it wished, to the general welfare. Congress, about the same time, then lifted the restraints on Congress's power to own real property. In 1939, the court almost entirely gutted the Second Amendment. In 1940, 41, 42, they abolished the limitations on Congress's commerce power. And then in 1942 and 1942, 43, 44, the court began to attack civil liberties. And this is where you see things like an American citizen being executed without trial by jury, or the court signing off on and agreeing to the mass incarceration of Americans of Japanese descent. So I call this period from 1937 to 1944 the nadir, the low point of the Supreme Court. Eventually, the court did start to enforce limits on the federal government again, but never to the full extent that the Constitution requires. And so we are left, as a result of the emergencies of the Great Depression and World War II, we're left with a federal government that's far, far more powerful than the Constitution authorizes.
I'll just keep asking questions unless folks want to raise their hand. Being in the commercial health payment space and being a lobbyist for a very old and venerable health freedom organization, I've met a lot of the scientists and doctors who are censored trying to ask normal questions that should be asked about the hysteria coming out of the CDC and the federal government. The politicization angle you mentioned is really key, I think, because a lot of defenders of what has happened will say, well, a lot of the orders came from governors and state public health departments. And so there was some difference that allowed for the experimentation to compare, and the leaving escape hatch was used, like you said, people going to decent states like Texas and Florida. But I think I would respond, a lot of those state orders stemmed from the FDA, CDC, and the NIH. The emergency authorization is being used by state legislatures to mandate vaccines on their own employees, something just repealed here in Virginia, or locally for kids in the schools. The politicization of early treatment has led to licensure threats against doctors who try to follow the Hippocratic Oath and do their job and prescribe effective treatments. So I think that angle, politicization, really bolsters your point to get rid of these agencies, because you can't really have vigorous experimentation, laboratories of democracy, unless you do have no excuse from the states to say, hey, the FDA said this, the CDC said this, that's why I'm doing this.
Yeah. When I was involved in Montana state government, specifically, I was an advisor to a state legislative committee on federalism matters and was involved in many other ways. I saw that when federal money is involved or federal influence is involved, then state officials often just disconnect their reason. So if we see this, for example, in the area of Medicaid. I mean, if the federal government is going to fund certain Medicaid procedures or not fund others, then the state sort of automatically goes along with it. That underscores the reason why these agencies and these funding programs need to be abolished. I found, however, this is a very difficult thing to persuade legislators of, even conservative legislators who in theory favor states' rights. I mean, they'll look at the line of lobbyists out there and they'll say, gee, if we try to abolish this agency, we'll get hit by lobbyists from all over and public outrage and media outrage. And my response to that is, as you suggested earlier, Charlie, you abolish the agency just once, and those lobbyists won't be back in all probability, because bureaucrats don't hang around and work for free. And the people who support the bureaucrats are generally there because they're getting some benefit from the government. So I think it really is important that these, not just the CDC and the NIH, but these federal programs that purport to, quote, help the states undertake state officials simply be eliminated. They are dysfunctional for that reason and for many others.
That's such a good point. Just take your medicine and the lobbyists disappear. It's a one-time painful, striking at the roots. Jim, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. We're seeing Governor DeSantis and maybe some others as well pushing back in terms of some of these health laws or the directives by the FDA, the CDC, that sort of thing. And I'm wondering, are they, I mean, in terms of the Constitution or legality or whatever, can they nullify the FDA's control over doctors, for example? Is that within their power? Or can they set up at least maybe sanctuary cities or sanctuary areas like they're doing for the illegal immigration that would protect doctors, for example, so they can practice as they want?
There's a legal answer here and there's a practical answer. The legal answer is no, not usually. The practical answer is sometimes. I mean, I'm sitting in the state of Colorado right now, which is famously nullified effectively government drug laws dealing with marijuana. The legal answer is that if the federal government acts within its constitutional authority, the state has no power to nullify. But the practical answer is sometimes when states push back, they can create sanctuary states or sanctuary cities, as has certainly been done in the area of immigration. Now, here's one of the great ironies here. The federal government is given by the Constitution the power to control immigration. In case you've never seen it, when you read the Constitution, it's in that clause which gives the Congress the power to define and punish offenses against the law of nations. There's no real question that the federal government has power to control immigration. And yet we've seen people on the left set up sanctuary cities and try to nullify unquestionably constitutional federal laws. On the other hand, these same people object strenuously if the states push back against laws that are clearly unconstitutional. One good thing that Republican-controlled states have done in recent months is they've sued the Biden administration over, for example, mandates. They got the OSHA mandate, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration mandate, put on hold, I think effectively nullified by the Supreme Court. There was another mandate that applied to contractors and subcontractors with the federal government, applying to like 20% of the state of the national labor force. They got that struck down at the Court of Appeals level, and they did not succeed in getting the healthcare worker mandate struck down. So it's good to see states acting aggressively. Let me also say that some of these states, like Texas, like Florida, especially Florida, are among the leaders in calling for a convention for proposing amendments to adopt constitutional amendments precisely to get the federal government out of some of these areas, as well as, I should add, imposing term limits on members of Congress and on officials. We already, of course, have term limits on the president.
Thank you.
As Dave, you unmute yourself to ask your question, let me do a quick follow-up. Some conservatives worrying about getting more than you asked for have kind of been nervous about the Article 5 option. I know a lot of people in that space. I've had several presentations over the years from people on the Article 5. There's various forms of it. Do you have a quick rebuttal to those who are worried that we may lose control of the Article 5 process? Because you're right. I mean, it's a powerful tool. It could do great things, but is there a worry it could not?
Yeah. Well, just as a matter of establishing credibility, if you've got your video on and you can see me, you are looking at the most published scholar on the Article 5 amendment process who is working today. I began my scholarship on the process in 2009. My research forced me to change my views in many ways. At one time, for example, I had a certain trepidation. I thought that the convention would consist of popularly elected delegates and it would be essentially uncontrollable. And most of what I thought I knew turned out to be false. And I have admitted this and explained this in a series of articles. I had to tell my constitutional law students that what I had said was false. Here's the bottom line. Number one, Article 5 has been construed by many, many, many court decisions. We understand the principles of the amendment process very well. Secondly, we know that the convention that proposes amendments is a convention of the states. We know that process very well. The Convention of the States mechanism actually goes back to when there were colonies. It's over 350 years old. And we know how that works very well. We know also that part of the Convention of States procedure is that the commissioners, the delegates who attend, are representatives of the state legislatures. They do what the state legislatures tell them to. We've had about 40 of these conventions. We've never had one that, quote, ran away, including the Constitutional Convention, contrary to popular belief. And we know very well how this works. We held the first Convention of Colonies in 1677. We held the most recent Convention of States in 2017. So we've got a lot of experience. The only difference is this is a Convention of States specifically for proposing constitutional amendments. We also know that any constitutional amendment it proposes has to be approved by 3/4 of the states, either legislatures or conventions. It's impossible to think of any really nutty proposal that would get past a convention like that, especially when it's going to be dominated by red states, and then in turn pass 3/4 of the states. The trepidation that you refer to, Charlie, the runaway convention story is a fiction. It was a fiction that was first publicized by liberal academics and publicists back in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, specifically to scare conservatives and libertarians out of having such a convention. They didn't want a convention for a balanced budget amendment. They didn't want a convention to overrule Roe versus Wade. These liberal groups didn't want a convention to overturn the reapportionment decisions and so forth. So they widely publicized this scare story. The liberal media, and I've documented this extensively, the liberal media, for example, the New York Times and the Washington Post, also publicized this scare story. It is essentially false. It's one of the greatest successes of disinformation in the history of the United States. When I first became involved in this process, in the research, this scare story was everywhere. Fortunately, people, by and large, are seeing through it. I'd be happy to talk to anybody who's got any doubts about this. I've also got a book out there called The Law of Article 5. The Law of Article 5 is the only treatise, it's a short legal treatise, only legal treatise on the market dealing with amendment law. And that discusses the decided cases and the principles and the history extensively. Also, I moderate a website called the Article 5 Information Center. Just enter Article 5 Information Center in your browser, and you'll come up with a website, and the website deals with almost every aspect of the convention process you could possibly imagine. So I didn't mean to dump the whole load on you, but I did want to reassure people and let them know that the scare story they may have heard is a piece of disinformation that simply has no basis in history, in law, or in reality, or in political feasibility.
We'll have you back on that topic, book through May, later on in the year, maybe.
If you wish.
Dave, I'm sorry, one more follow-up. This is critical. A lot of health freedom folks want a health freedom amendment based, I guess, on the Ogden decision now. Informed consent, right to try, freedom of choice, Hippocratic oath. Any quick comment on that? I know Dave is ready to ask the question.
Yeah, I think that's important. So long as the amendment does not have the appearance of conceding to the federal government any control over health policy. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In the past, there have been proposals for a balanced budget amendment, which will say something like the federal government should not have a budget that exceeds 19% of GDP. Well, once you do that, you effectively gut any potential judicial challenge later on to anything that the federal government is funding up to 19% of GDP. So such an amendment should be written in such a way as to not concede authority to the federal government over healthcare policy, and that can be done. The trick is in the drafting. Drafting amendments is not, I hate to say this, but it's not for amateurs. It is a really technical field. When the amendment finally comes out, it looks really short and simple, and people say, well, anybody can do that. But if it's the wrong short and simple words, you've got trouble. A great example was the Equal Rights Amendment back in the 1970s. People looked at it and says, well, equal rights for women, that should be obvious. But it was poorly drafted. It was so poorly drafted that people realized it would be a judicial and political nightmare in enforcing. That's what you want to avoid. One other thing, Charlie, I mentioned that somebody had a question because it was a hand up that said something like, is there any advantage in electing constitutional sheriffs? And the answer to that question is yes and no. If you're electing a sheriff who understands the Constitution and understands the limit on governmental powers, yeah, that's great. Sometimes the constitutional sheriff movement has overpromised or overstated. So you'll see it's not so much in their literature now, but the literature used to be something like the sheriff is an independent official, owes his responsibility only to the people or only to the Constitution. That's not legally accurate. The sheriff is an official of the state. The sheriff originated as a royal official in England, who was responsible to the crown. And in our constitutional system, the successor of the crown is usually viewed to be the state government. So ultimately, the sheriff is a functionary of the state government. He's not some entirely constitutionally independent official, as some people have claimed. Nevertheless, it's always best to elect any official that you can who respects the Constitution's limits on governmental authority. And that's true whether the candidate is running for sheriff or running for state legislature or running for any other office.
Thanks, Rob. Dave, finally, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, so you mentioned that it would be a good idea to eliminate the CDC, and to the extent that anything they're doing is worthwhile, the other agencies could pick it up, or maybe the states. And I guess where I'm coming from, I'm seeing that the problem that we're having with the COVID vaccines and really the COVID response in general, it's horrific, but it's not altogether new. And there have been big problems for many years now with the vaccine programs, and a lot of that is related to state activity. So what I have been promoting is basically a complete separation of vaccines and state, where they just have nothing to do with the development or promotion or what have you of vaccines. So I'm wondering, is there any way to kind of pursue that type of change?
Well, I don't disagree with what your program is. I don't believe that government really should be involved in healthcare. I'm not a strict libertarian. I would favor some kind of social safety net, but the deeper the government, any level of government, is involved in healthcare, the more dysfunctional and the more abusive, and I think the worse healthcare system you've got. For my way of thinking, though, there are priorities. There are always political priorities. And I think that having healthcare controlled from the center, from the federal government, is far worse than having it controlled at the state level. I can always leave the state, I have a little bit more ability to defeat members of the state legislature whose records I don't like. And so one of the things I've learned is in politics is you have to choose your battles very carefully. This is especially true for conservatives and libertarians. Conservatives and libertarians do not have control over the mainstream media. They obviously do not have control over the bureaucracy. When they play in the political arena, the playing field is tilted against them. I mean, the other side, use a football analogy, we get 2 downs and the other side gets 6 downs and we have to run uphill. And so conservatives and libertarians always have to, when dealing in politics, engage in political jujitsu. What pressure point, what specific area can we work at for maximum effect and for maximum political feasibility? And so that's why I tend to focus, one reason why I tend to focus on the federal government. I think also that long-term, the trends around despite what you see in the current eddies, I think long-term, the trends around the globe are toward decentralization. And to the extent we work against federal control of healthcare, then those long-term trends tend to work in our favor.
Dr. Benz, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes, Charlie. I think it's a fascinating discussion, but it's one we've been having too long. It seems like we're spending 99% of our time reacting to a system that's broken and should be fundamentally changed. And so if we continue to waste time and money and effort just reacting to a system that shouldn't be there in the first place, then we're kind of foolish to spend more time on that. It's like rearranging the ships on the Titanic. You know, there's time to admit that the ship is sinking and to get the hell off of it and stop arranging the ship's chairs. So a new approach might be to just say, let's draft a general amendment for state legislatures to consider. That's like, starts with a health and wellness bill of rights, and then starts to consider prevention as the number one goal of any healthcare plan, because 80% of disease is preventable. We only spend 5%, maybe 3% in some studies on prevention. And so then we could talk in this legislation about evidence-based medicine, that would be the only medicine. We would define evidence-based as something that has better than a 1 or 2% efficacy, which most of the drugs have that are being used by the existing system. And so to me, the goal should be to have a system that's measured on outcomes, which is not currently done, and that everything that's done should lead to safer, more effective, and less costly care. It would not be hard to draft that kind of sort of draft legislation, and then let the people act out and mention how much they're going to like it. It doesn't have to be libertarian. It doesn't have to be Republican or Democrat. I think if you pick something that's a great idea, it won't matter where it came from initially. What matters is that people are ready for it. And if they're ready for it, then they'll push their legislatures in the right direction to get it done. And so that to me seems to be a better use of our time and effort than continuing to just react to things that we shouldn't even be having to talk about.
Well, as to our reactiveness, I couldn't agree more. I've long advocated the need to go on the offensive, to take it to the other side. That's one reason why I support the convention for proposing amendments. It is a way of positive action. It's a way, for example, to get an amendment such as you described adopted. It's certainly not going to be proposed by Congress, but it might very well be proposed by the states. When I was active in state politics, I was proactive always with what I did. So if the other side did something that was bad, I didn't just try to react to that. I went over their heads and went on the offensive, and was very successful in that way. Some of these proactive methods, particularly in healthcare, can be done at the state level. For example, in 2010, the Independence Institute, the free market think tank with which I'm affiliated, proposed a popular initiative that would have been adopted in the Colorado Constitution that said that the state of Colorado did not have authority to participate in any program that interfered with patient choice. And patient choice was defined and laid out. So the effect would have been, if that amendment was adopted, only defeated by a very narrow margin, the effect would have been that Colorado could not have participated in programs like Obamacare, which interfered with patient choice. So things can be done at the state level as well. Here's another example. I was involved in this also. Expanding the right of compensation that property owners have from merely compensation for a technical taking to a compensation for any government regulation that reduced property value by a certain amount. The idea being that if somebody is damaged, if its property is damaged by an environmental regulation, for example, the government must compensate. That not only has the advantage of being just, it also has the advantage of assuring that if environmental regulation is passed, it's really going to advance the general welfare because people are going to be willing to make the compensation. So those are all examples of instances of going on the offensive. I think it's very important that we do that we do not allow our agenda to be set by the progressive left as merely reacting to them or to the media. Let me just mention one other example. It's not exactly a policy one, but it's an example of trying to reframe the discussion. The media have been defining diversity on the Supreme Court exclusively in terms of race and gender. And therefore, they say putting a Black woman on the court is going to increase the diversity of the court. I have an article in the Epoch Times right now that points out that actually most of the Black women on President Biden's list would reduce the diversity on the court, or at least not increase it in various ways. And I go on to explain what real diversity means on the court. And so, yeah, I agree 100%. We cannot let the other side define our agenda, nor can we be merely reactive. We must define our own agenda and be proactive.
Can I comment real quickly, Charlie?
Yeah.
These are all legal terms. These are not medical and health terms. And so we need to have people that actually understand the problem. The problem is 99% of state legislators and boards of health are locked into the allopathic medical system, which is not really an evidence-based medical system. They only have evidence for 20% of what they do. And so we need to change the narrative by getting people involved that understand how science works and how the science in medicine works. So if you don't have the right people drafting these amendments, we're not going to have the genesis of the change that's needed. You have to get natural functional medicine doctors involved and scientists. These are the ones who have to then work with the attorneys and some of the other legislative people that can draft something that's feasible and doable. And so it's a combination situation, but we can't continue to allow the people to guide our system that really don't know what the hell they're talking about. And so they're being guided by the media and big pharma and a lot of other these pressure groups. We need to change that by changing the narrative and getting the people involved so that the public can make their own decisions about the information when it's presented in an open format. We need a format to have this discussion. We do not have that format currently.
I agree with that. My comments were legal comments, but if you notice that they all involved opening windows. When you open the window to patient choice, for example, by saying the state government cannot participate in any program inconsistent with patient choice, or when you open the window to a constitutional amendment that gets the federal government out of these areas, those are windows through which the movement you're talking about can move.
Yes, we need those windows for sure, but the people don't know what they don't know, just like the doctors don't know what they don't know, and the politicians don't know what they don't know. And so until we get to the point where the evidence is actually presented about the difference between this scientific fact and this unscientific fact, we will never get to the solution that we're looking for. We must have those discussions. Let's call for a series of debates and get people on the media debating these topics and actually having an open discussion. We must either start it that way on our own and let it build, or we have to get it infused into the system because we're wasting a lot of time and money.
Rob, I think what you might say is that for a state effort, a multi-state effort that Dr. Benz is talking about, you probably first have to get the amendment passed in the Article 5 process to get the feds out of the way of the states to experiment.
Yeah, that's right. Because as long as the feds have a lock on this process, they will marginalize any effort to change the healthcare system or any change in healthcare philosophy. They'll cancel anybody who tries to get that discussion going. By the way, there's another aspect to this too, besides the legal aspect and the health aspect, which is really important, and that is leadership. Very often you see grassroots movements that could bring about change that simply founder for lack of adequate leadership, for lack of adequate follow through. We saw that with the Tea Party, for example. I suspect we'll probably see that with the Canadian truckers movement, unless they come up with some outstanding leader who can navigate the political system and translate the potential into actual. That's one of the difficulties that conservative and libertarians have in working in the political system, is that it really takes outstanding leadership to help guide this process. It can't simply be done by spontaneous order alone.
Right.
And
Can I give you two examples of where
Dr.
it
Benz,
can't
we're out
work?
of time. We can't load onto YouTube if we go any longer. So we'll have
Okay.
to continue this conversation later. Rob, if you want to say a last word on how folks can reach you.
Oh, sure. The best way to contact me is through the Independence Institute, which is independenceinstitute.org. Also, everything I write is on that site. And if you're interested in Article 5, then there's the Article 5 Information Center, which is also operated by the Independence Institute. And as I said, if you want to reach me, you can do that through the Independence Institute phones or email system.
So what about your wealth? If your money could actually talk to you, would you listen to it? Well, with the DNA Network Academy, your money actually can talk to you. And it's going to tell you just what it told this client. This family had over 24 debts, mortgages, car loans, the works. They were on track to take 20 years to pay it all off and instead did it in 8.5. Plus, they did it without refinancing, making more money, or even changing their lifestyle. So find out for yourself with a free analysis that is completely confidential. No personal information, no social security numbers, no credit checks, none of that nonsense. But what is exciting is that the outcome of that report you receive is a guaranteed outcome for you. To get that report, head on over to bit.ly/debt to wealth. You will arrive at this simple form. Fill it in as simple as lender number 1 and credit card number 2. What really matters is the accuracy of your numbers. You'll be able to see that if instead of 20 years or whatever your number is, that you may actually be out of debt and on your way to wealth in as little as 6.3 years like this client.